Atheist Alliance International Podcast.
I don't make this stuff up.
You know, if you put Jesus Christ first, that he'll look after all your bills.
It's not fake, it's faith.
Hello and welcome to this week's AAI Podcast. I'm Jason Sylvester, aka Diogenes Mayberry, and this week we're joined by three people. We've got two Aussie fundamentalists, ex-fundamentalists, and one ex-American fundamentalist who are here to compare and contrast their experiences in their fundamentalist churches. So just before we get started, I'd like to invite everyone to like and subscribe, and go ahead and hit that button. And so let's get started with Deanna, ladies first. So Deanna, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing? When you have a book, so tell us a little bit about that.
Okay. I have a book called Of Ashes and Embers, exploring spiritual trauma, and it's basically about my story of religious trauma syndrome and how that came to pass in the evangelical church. The years that I spent there, everything that I experienced, and it correlates a lot of psychological, ideas with it. And I put it out there in 2000, at the end of 2000. I've been departed from the church for 11 years, but at the end of 2000, we just saw the floodgates open and everybody was fleeing the church here in the U.S. And I felt like I wanted to release this book so that I could tell my story and that other people understood that what they were experiencing was normal in that situation. And I didn't want them to feel like they were alone. So I released the book, and so far so good. It's been read in Germany, in Poland, in the UK, in Canada, and in the States. So.
Okay, great. And which branch of the church were you in?
I was a non-denominational evangelical.
Non-denominational, okay. But you weren't in that whack job church in Kansas, right?
No. Wow, yeah, no.
I can never remember their name, but they're not important, so.
Right.
Okay. All right. And we're joined by two Australians known as T and B, and they have a podcast called I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist. So welcome, T and B, and can you tell us a little bit about yourselves?
Awesome. Thank you. Look, I think it's quite similar, actually. You know, I guess we started out, we've been friends for 30 years, and we quite often catch up after our fundamentalist experience and start to, I guess, debrief about it many years on. And we thought, why not hit record? Let's have a chat. And I think it's similar, just to send the message out that people aren't alone, that the people that do leave fundamentalism in Australia and around the world, we've got an audience that certainly reached out to us from around the world to talk about how they identify with leaving. And I think it's started a bit of a community of people that have come together with similar experiences. T?
Yeah, about 2/3 of our audience are Australian and about 1/3 from the US, funny enough. And then, I know that I've just gone over 3/3, but then there are smatterings from sort of the UK and New Zealand. And sometimes we trend in Norway. We trended in Ireland for a little while there. I don't know why, but we did. So we have an audience sort of from all over the place, but yeah, mostly Australians. And we sort of see the US as the mother culture when it came to church. Everything came from the US. The music we listened to, the Bibles that we read were printed there. Well, at least they were, edited and published there. The speakers that we would listen to, we were just talking the other day on one of our episodes about a premarital counselling course that B did with his ex-wife, and that came from Willow Creek in the US, right, from Bill Hybels' church. And we know all those names. These people are like, teachers, leaders, even for us being all the way in Australia.
Okay. And were you guys both in the same church together? As you said, you've known each other for 30 years?
Sort of, kind of. I think T had certainly a deeper experience, certainly in cult land, but we did meet probably around about 30 years ago in the same church, which was known as the Australian Christian churches now, but the Assemblies of God back then, which was very much a Pentecostal church. It was the Pentecostal church in Australia back in the 80s and 90s, and it was definitely the place to go.
Yeah, and they were the Assemblies of God, and they changed their name to Australian Christian Churches, and then Hillsong came out of that. So you guys probably know Hillsong, and you may have heard of another group called C3 or Christian City Churches. That's another one that sort of sprang from that place as well. So they're now sort of making a splash internationally, but we were there, weren't we? We were there when they were just sprouting wings, really.
We were, and we were glad to leave before the wings fully sprouted. That's for sure.
That's right, because they're retarded. They're not good.
It's not good.
Yeah,
Was it Sarah Palin?
The evangelical religion 11 years ago, and I'm glad that I left when I did, because I'm sure y'all have seen what's transpired here. It's made headlines, So, but it's really become a very dark Abrahamic sort of, like they're all aligning with each other. It's very violent and vocally. Obviously a little bit physical as well, and it's quite scary to see what it's turned into since I have left, and it was getting bad at the point that I left. So
you'll show me a capital and we'll storm it.
I didn't hear. I'm sorry.
I said, show me a capital and we'll storm it. That's what seems to happen with the evangelicals.
Exactly. Yeah.
Wasn't
It's like
Sarah
they've taken
Palin?
on this mindset, they're literally pulling from scripture their behaviors, and they've taken on this mindset that it's no longer internal, that they believe that they're having to show it physically,
Yeah. Was Sarah Palin was Assemblies of God, was she not?
She may have been American AOG, but yeah, look, I left in 1999. That was when I stopped attending church, and so I haven't had anything to do with it since. I think B left about 10 years after me, but we maintained a friendship over that time. So what you guys look at and say, oh, it's just getting so bad, and it is. There's no doubt, especially in the US, it's getting crazy bad. But it was bad 20 years ago as well.
Yes.
Evangelicalism was still, a crazy belief system that we all sort of went along with, and it's funny because I hear some of the terms, like what they're now calling deconstruction, 20 years ago, we called deconversion, right? And what they called purity culture, we called guarding your virginity or whatever. There's all these sort of terms that have sort of shifted, but it's still the same thing. And as we say, in Australia, we say it's the same shit, different bucket. But I think it's the same shit, same bucket, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
And the evangelicals in Australia have gotten a little more extreme in the last 20 years as they have in the US?
I don't know about more extreme in the last 20 years, but certainly with COVID, we've seen a lot of really craziness come out. And I think, B, this is one that's more closer to your heart, isn't it? The craziness that's come out with COVID.
There has been a lot of craziness, not with me, I'd like to clarify. But we also, in Australia, we have a Pentecostal Prime Minister. So it's a very interesting space in that we've seen a bleeding of faith in with politics at a greater level than we've seen in many, many years. So I think that has been certainly a game changer. But with COVID, we've definitely seen, and I'd be interested to see, Deanna, whether it's the same in the States, that definitely the New World Order is something that's been brought up constantly in Australia within the conservative evangelical circles, that the COVID vaccine is the mark of the beast. This is the ushering in of a New World Order. Yep. So I'm interested to hear your reflections from an American perspective.
Yeah, there's all of the conspiracy theories that are happening here over COVID. I think that they've gone so far as to say that the shot gives you a chip that controls you. Yeah, it's pretty bad with the COVID situation here. I mean, they're I think they're pushing in the Supreme Court right now, attempting to have their faith rights and not get the shot. I know that Biden has set forth a law to where it's becoming mandatory, but they just, they're not. There's no common sense that's being used, amongst that specific culture, where they're considering anything more than it being a way to control them. And I don't know if you follow my Twitter page at all and what I post on there, but AmericanFaith.com has gone way out there. They take ownership of this. What I thought was a conspiracy was Q, but they take ownership of this Q, and they're going about preaching the gospel, but in a very viciously violent way, and they've got masses of crowds following them, and they're preaching assault against people who don't believe as they do. It's insanity.
I said to B, when B pointed out to me about he reported to me about the stories of that they are infecting us with the chips, and then in the year 2030 they're going to flick a switch and 6 million people are going to die. And I said to him, you do realize that that's the plot of Avengers Infinity War, right? That they were going to get all these things sort of set up, and then someone's going to click their fingers, and then half of us are going to die, kind of thing. And so my daughter recently went to a play date at a friend's house, and the mother started saying that to my daughter at the play date, and it was really funny because I'd worded my daughter up, and my daughter said, "I said, what'd you say?" And she said, "I told him that was the Avengers Infinity War, Dad." That's what I said.
I mean, it's one of the reasons I got the COVID jab was I don't want to be one of those people left cleaning up 6 billion bodies that have dropped dead. What a shit job. I mean, that's not what I want to do.
Right.
So we know in the U.S. the evangelicals are sort of the majority, but they're declining rapidly. Do you guys have any sense of the statistics in Australia, what the evangelical Christian ratio is?
Much smaller.
I'm not sure.
Much
T might know the ratio, but it's the fastest growing religion in Australia, from what I understand. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's Pentecostalism. I think Pentecostalism is one of the fastest. I think Islam, because of previous migration, I think Islam was the fastest. But Pentecostalism definitely was one of the fastest growing religions in Australia, but definitely nothing like we see in the States, nothing like that ratio. I mean, I think Hillsong is, point something % of the population. Pentecostalism, broadly together, I'd be surprised if it was even 1%. And then when you start to count in, evangelical, Anglicans and Baptists and those kinds of people, it would just be a few %. We're certainly not looking at the US, where you've got the ability to mobilize large percentages of the population to sway elections and things like that. It just doesn't happen that way here. But the people that are in that camp are very vocal and very loud, and they've certainly got more clout or more sway than they should have.
Yeah.
So your current PM who was elected, who is a Pentecostal, he didn't sweep to power like Trump did on the backs of the Christian right. He just came into power on his own.
He did. Scarily enough, people voted for him, and he's probably the least inspiring leader that you could think of. He's probably the best way to describe him as flaccid. There's nothing inspiring about him. The way he's handled the COVID pandemic has been absolutely horrendous. But he certainly, the churches have the ears, has his ear. And what's interesting today is in a couple of states in Australia, they've actually mandated the vaccine for churches. So it's quite interesting. It'll be interesting to see the backlash that comes from that, because probably around about half of the Australian population is now mandated to have the vaccine. Otherwise, they actually can't participate in many of those things that we would take for granted. So it's an interesting time, and I think that is feeding into that narrative that it is a war and that it is something that is a bit of an uprising, and the coming of Christ is near, and all those sort of interesting things.
Yeah.
Okay. So they're anti-vax there in Australia as they are in the US. Are the Australian evangelicals very sort of anti-science and anti-climate change and anti-intellectual anything like they are in the US?
You've got in Australia, you've got some different factions even within evangelicalism, right? So you've got the evangelical right, but you've also got the evangelical left. And the evangelical left are the folks that, they want to feed the poor, they want to, care about refugees and this kind of thing. And they're good neighbors and they're good people, and you wouldn't be offended by them. They're also the kind of people that they won't stand on the street corner and preach at you and hand out tracts, right? They're more about, loving people into the kingdom and that kind of talk. And so you've got that happening in Australia, but you've also got the fanatical right within evangelicalism as well. And you tend to find that the evangelical right expresses itself more in sort of, I don't know, maybe that sort of conservative politically. So that could include your Church of England, your Anglicans, but then your hardcore Pentecostals, which are, and that's where we came from, which are the sort of the freak show, aren't they, B? They're the ones running around saying, that the COVID jab is the mark of the beast. And they're the ones that would say, we believe in Jesus, yet at the same time, I think they would be first to string him up with all his leftist ideas.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And over in America, what they call the evangelical left are progressives, and a lot of them, and they're kind-hearted. They're not trying to push their beliefs on you. They seem to be very balanced with, what they choose to believe and allowing for whatever else anybody else believes. Sometimes, most of the time, I would say. But the evangelical right, which are the conservatives, are the ones that are excessive in their behaviors and their thoughts. The progressives who are coming out of evangelicalism, the extremists of them, are obviously, it takes a while to convert your ideas into something new. So they are, I think, the ones that are a little more assertive, and they still run about wanting to save everyone, but they are a little more gentle than the evangelical conservatives. So and the dangers that I'm seeing in it is that they've started offering a organized faith-based curriculum to deconstruct from conservative evangelicalism to progressive, and obviously that's, you're still deconstructing into something that's been organized by the church. It's still, if you can go down to this level, is it possible that they can bring you back up to that other level again? So it's still a process of not thinking for yourself outside of what they want you to think. So.
Yeah, that's right. They talk about deconstruction, but then there's the whole Christian reconstruction, people trying to sort of catch these people rather than letting them go to a place of unbelief. And I think it was Josh Harris, wasn't it? The I Kiss Dating Goodbye. I think that was the guy who started publishing this curriculum. And there was a lot of backlash, even from his own deconstruction fold, against that, for sure. But see, but can you hear what I'm saying? Even the fact that you mentioned that, and we know the names and we know the people, is because America is the mother culture, right? And what you guys do on Wednesday, we do on Thursday.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
You don't hear much about the evangelical left at all. So are the evangelical left also young earth creationists and evolution deniers in your countries, or they're a little more intellectually enlightened?
Yeah. You wouldn't find them you may have people that secretly, still want to believe that Adam and Eve were literal people, but they're not necessarily going to say that it was a 6-day creation or 6,000 years kind of talk. But it's a spectrum, right? And so you've got people further down the evangelical left and further up the evangelical right, and there's a lot of people that sort of live in the middle. And a lot of those, there's a lot of cross-pollination in those two groups. They'll still worship together, they'll still connect with one another. And I think the further they go up towards the left and the further they go to sort of more smaller, liberal, progressive theology, the less dangerous they become. But I don't see a lot of people hyper left going back to the right, though. It seems to be more, it hemorrhages out. But I heard someone say recently that you don't really convert anyone to the evangelical left or to that progressive. It's really just evangelical refugees that end up there. And I think that's true. I think most people, that end up in the left, or let's call them progressives, their children won't really adopt that religion. I heard Bart Campolo talking about that the other day, that people who move into that place, they don't hand it on to their kids because there's nothing to hand on. It's almost secularism.
Yeah.
And do you have a sense of how much of that migration is going on? Like, is the evangelical left growing?
Yeah, I think the nuns, and I'll let you have a chat in a minute, B, sorry. The nuns and the duns in Australia is growing. Those numbers are growing. Like the fact that we've put together this podcast, it's one of the first in Australia. There are other podcasts that are sort of interview-based and people will talk about issues, etc. But there's not really anything of people getting in and saying, I was a teenage fundamentalist and here's my story. And so we try and get people to come in and talk about their stories as well as we sort of chronologically go through our own. But it wouldn't have existed even 5 years ago, whereas now I think we've sort of hit critical mass and there's a lot of people ready to hear that and hear their stories as we tell ours.
Yeah, and I think there's been a bit of an evolution too, in that there's a growth at either end of the spectrum. Like you are seeing the extreme right in Pentecostalism growing, but you're also seeing the more progressive left growing. There's very little in between. I don't know, T, if you've got a similar reflection, but maybe they're just the noisier ones. Maybe they're the ones that we're hearing, but you're certainly seeing very polarizing views in the space, and there is a bit of a growth. There's certainly, and that's, again, we've picked this up from the US, the ex-evangelical movement is something that's very real, and people are moving to, I think they're trying to seek some meaning in another space and trying to contextualize their beliefs, whatever they may be, as they move to a bit more of a progressive space, and they pick up the label ex-evangelical. But certainly that social justice lens is something that we do see a bit more of, and there's a bit more vocal in that space.
Yeah, and so too with our podcast, as much as we are not Christians and we are not progressive Christians or anything like that, but we don't discourage those people from tuning into our podcast or connecting with us through our Facebook group and that kind of thing, because it is oftentimes a really good step in the right direction. And I think if we alienate those people, then they're missing out, and they're missing out on the support and the sort of community and stuff that we're offering through the podcast. So whilst we're not at that place, we don't alienate those people either. We invite them into the dialogue and into the conversation. We've even interviewed a few people, haven't we, B, that are actually in that place, and we tried really hard not to be hostile, really hard.
We did.
It's hard to be hostile when they have questions, it's easy to be hostile when they're attacking. But over the last 11 years, I have had the privilege of watching so many different people deconstruct from that. And contrary to popular belief, it doesn't happen like that. It's a process that we end up going through because we mentally held on to every belief that we had. And so it's a long process, and there's no, set path for any person to take. I think it's really according to what caused them, how much did they believe? How sincerely did they believe? How deeply did they believe? What caused them to question their beliefs? There's so many different things that create someone that decides that they're going to start deconstructing from their belief. And it takes a very, very long time to do it. So yeah, compassion, patience, everything that you can possibly give to someone that you see, even the tinge of, wondering what else might be out there, that is absolutely necessary to offer to them. Because, I mean, if we as non-believers are going at them with, just constant negativity, then that's also going to push them back in the corner. That's what they're trying to get away from anyway. So, agreed completely, wholeheartedly. We can't, just be hostile toward them. We have to be open and willing to talk with them. I do, however, stand face to face with people who are hostile toward non-believers, because they are the problem that we're seeing right now in this country.
How's that playing out?
How is it playing out with me when I stand that way? It doesn't.
No. How's it playing out in the States, that hostility?
It doesn't. No. I mean, but nor does trying to be genuine with them either. They believe what they believe, and they don't want to change their views. I can remember speaking with an atheist when I was a Christian, and they had some, looking back, hindsight on it, they had some really logical ideas that they were saying, but it wasn't something that I was willing to accept. I still wanted to try and convert them to my belief, so it is what it is. The problem that I have with people who are, with the ones that are hostile toward others, is that they're so toxic when it comes to harming individuals that may be questioning their faith, or harming individuals that have already been harmed by the religious system. That's the huge problem that I have with those individuals.
Yeah, I feel that too. When the whole, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, what do they call them? The four horsemen of the atheist apocalypse. When that all broke, I was ready. I was ready to just devour their writings, and I did. But the thing is, after a period of time, I just felt like I couldn't stay in that sort of angry, atheist, intolerant sort of atheist place. I couldn't just stay in that place. And I really like when you look at Twitter, you've got the gentle atheist, the care, all these people have these titles, the gentle atheist, the compassionate atheist. And I think within atheism, there is an awareness that there needs to be much more compassionate, there needs to be much more gentleness, that this sort of flippant intolerance of religious people on their journeys doesn't land. It doesn't get you where you want to go. And that's why I look at someone like Bart Campolo with his Humanize Me stuff. I don't know if you guys have come across him. He's Tony Campolo's son. And he is trying really hard to build community and to love people, etc. And he uses a lot of that Christian lingo, but from an atheist perspective. And so we've tried to embody that as well with our podcast. So we will call the bullshit on fundamentalism as we saw it, etc. But we try to be, I don't know, what would you say, be more accepting of people, whatever stage of that journey they're on, yeah?
Yeah, I guess just helping them process it and work through it at their own pace. And I think the community that we've created completely unintentionally is a bit of a mutual help community where people do get together, process stuff, and quite often just come out the other side of it making sense and seeing the stupidity sometimes of what they actually have believed, and how easily they've fallen for the shit in the past, and being able to process that and make something of it coming out the other side. But also, really importantly, knowing that that whatever time you had in fundamentalism isn't lost. You know, you can recontextualize it. That is something you can pull together into the future and into the now, and actually make something positive of it. You leave a lot of the shit behind, and you absolutely have to do that. But there's so much good stuff that you can generalize your learnings and bring it forward. And I think it's really important to do that, because otherwise people just sit there and become bitter and twisted.
Bitter, twisted, and angry. You know, one of the most popular threads, in fact, there's been a few of them, is where we create Christian contemporary music playlists, right, on in our Facebook group. And none of us, like, we're not Christians anymore. Well, a few of us are. I think there's a few progressives in there. But we'll play Amy Grant and DC Talk and all these kinds of bands, which I admit 10 years ago I couldn't have done, whereas now we kind of listen to it and people say, hey, remember this one, remember that one. And there's no faith. We're not believing this stuff anymore, but it's who we were, and it's what's made us who we are. And we're enjoying that a lot.
Yeah, that's it. They're signposts in the journey. I think,
exactly right.
We've been on.
Although I still can't listen to Keith Green. He triggers me far too much. But DC Talk I can do from time to time.
So if evangelicalism is declining in the US, do you guys have a sense of what's driving the increase of Pentecostalism in Australia?
The music.
Yeah.
The music, the preaching, the Prime Minister.
Yeah, look, it's been marketed incredibly well, and they've really picked up. And you know, I dare say, and it's anecdotal, it's no evidence behind it, but a lot of people are there because it's a really good social space. Like, these places market themselves as a really good party. There's some great music. There's some incredible vibes, I guess, through the space. I'm sure a lot of people are there searching for something, but they market themselves exceptionally well, and it's a really attractive space. And you see a lot of people attracted in it. Look, I'm sure, like, in the States, you've got American Idol. In Australia, we've got we had Australian Idol. We've got The Voice. Those shows, more often than not in Australia, I'm not sure if it's the same in the States, are won by people that are from Pentecostal megachurches. So the professionalized side of these churches in terms of music and just how polished they are incredibly attractive. And
the message is very positive. The message that they're preaching is, you know, it's prosperity gospel, that God wants you to be rich and God wants you to be successful, and you know, they will run outreaches to the poor, etc., purely as marketing, you know, avenues, really, just to say, oh, we are doing this, you know. But really, the message is all prosperity, success. It's very much, you know, but they've taken that sort of hokey. And sorry to say this, Deanna, but they've taken that sort of hokey Southern America feel and they've repackaged it in a very swish, urban, you know, tattoos, earrings, you know, the latest, you know, sneakers, that kind of thing. And I know you see that in the mega churches in the States as well. But they're doing it really well here. So they're really appealing to young people. So you can be a Christian and be rich. As a matter of fact, that's what God wants for you. You can be a Christian and have a successful career at, you know, at Google, for example. In fact, that's what God wants for you. And so no one has to sort of give up too much to actually join in with this anymore. It's not like you have to break up with your girlfriend or give your career up. You can have it all.
And God has the other 10%.
Oh, that's right. You got to give you 10%.
And are Australian Pentecostals like the American Pentecostals in snake handling and speaking in tongues, or it's more the high energy services?
Tongues is a big part. It's a huge part, actually. We did a whole episode on it now, our podcast, and it was a lot of fun. But tongues is a big part. It's the evidence of the Spirit is the way that they bring it across, I guess. And snake handling, not so much. I don't think.
Yeah, especially in Australia, no one here is stupid enough to pick up any snakes.
No, in Australia, for those people that don't know, Australia has 9 out of the world's 10 most deadliest snakes. So you don't touch our snakes. It's not a great thing. But yeah, certainly the tongues thing, the craziness, the whole high energy, the very polished showmanship, that is very much part of the marketing tool.
We would still have pockets of that hokey Pentecostalism too, but they're not the ones making the impact. They're not the Hillsongs. They're not the Australian Christian churches, the C3. Not at all.
So they're being pragmatic, and that they recognize that how lethal snakes are in Australia, and they've set that aside and just gone for more speaking in tongues. So okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, and
I know
handling teddy bears.
we were in our Twitter chat last week. We were talking a bit, and the whole Pentecostal movement comes out of like the last few verses of Mark, the Gospel book of Mark, where it talks about speaking in tongues and snake handling, and yet biblical scholars know that ending is not original to Mark. It was tacked on to make it jive with the other two synoptic gospels. So you've got this whole religious movement that's basically based on a forgery, which I find rather cosmically ironic.
Yep. Yeah, that's it. But don't let history and truth get in the way of a good religion, right?
True. Of any religion. Okay.
Absolutely.
And you guys are saying that Hillsong came out of the U.S. and is now came out of Australia and is now in the U.S. And you mentioned Justin Bieber, so I presume he got involved in that through his wife.
Well, Justin Bieber. Oh, sorry, you go, Beck.
I was going to say it's interesting. So we interviewed Tara Jane Stevens. I don't know, the Heaven Bent podcast. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with Heaven Bent. So Tara Jane Stevens is based in Vancouver and did this podcast a couple of years ago based on the Toronto blessing, the movement back in the 90s of, the coming of the Spirit and the new age of the Spirit and all that sort of stuff.
The holy laughter.
The holy laughter.
I was there. I lived in Toronto then, and I had a colleague who was involved in that church.
Well, I think if you listen to Heaven Bent, you'll be really interested. It's a really
brilliant
great
podcast. Very slick.
Podcast.
Very slick, yeah.
But we interviewed Tara Jean, and she was actually saying that Justin Bieber and his family were involved in the Toronto movement back then. So he actually had his roots back in it back then, and now has firmly planted himself in the Hillsong movement, along with some other famous artists. Chance the Rapper is another one, and they're really marketing themselves as, and they quite often do it here as well. So Hillsong will definitely market themselves through some of the stars or the musicians that have risen up through the ranks in Australia, and will say, look, this person came from us. And it's definitely happened in the States as well with Bieber and Chance the Rapper.
Okay. Because I know that Justin Bieber's wife is the daughter of Stephen Baldwin, the actor who was in The Usual Suspects. And I recall seeing an interview with him that he became a fundamentalist Christian as a result of 9/11. So his reaction to Islamic fundamentalists was to become a Christian fundamentalist.
The irony.
Yeah, I think he made a couple of hokey Christian movies as well when he became a fundamentalist. But yeah, Bieber and these others, especially through Hillsong in the US, although I think Bieber has recently distanced himself from Hillsong. I think he's now connected to some other group, is what I heard, but I could be wrong. But it's very much, they've taken a leaf out of Scientology's book where they court the superstars and then they promote these superstars as being, part of us. So again, started in Australia, now we're transplanted back into America, but the model, Deanna, came from the US. That's where it all came from.
Mm-hmm.
We blame you.
Yeah. We're experiencing this over there, but religious trauma syndrome is a huge thing that's happening here. So, are y'all experiencing that, the religious trauma syndrome from people leaving these types of churches?
Of course, yeah. But, it wasn't something that I think a lot of people have sort of labeled. It's funny you say that, because today I was listening to a podcast on religious trauma syndrome, and they were talking about how religious trauma syndrome isn't officially anything yet in any of the sort of diagnostic tools because it's so new. But even trauma itself is so new. Right, as an idea. I mean, being able to, we've got post-traumatic stress disorder, and there's a few others, but the idea of religious trauma is, it's still new. However, 20 years ago, that's exactly what I experienced. right?
Mhm.
What I went through, there wasn't a label for it. It was just called being messed up by the church. But that's exactly what it was. Yeah. So I'm hoping for us to actually do an episode on religious trauma and sort of, getting some experts in to come and speak. That's a good idea, by the way, B. I think I just floated it to you now. But yeah, I'd really like to do that because I think it's really valid.
Yeah, I think that the only argument on the term is the syndrome aspect of it. But there's just so many people that are coming forward after leaving these styles of churches. They're coming forward and they're having the same symptoms, and complex post-traumatic stress disorder happens to be a very common symptom within all of them. And when I first left the church, I knew something was wrong with me when I ended up having a mental breakdown, and I felt like I was walking outside of myself, like I was not connected inside of myself, or that I was hovering beside myself and going. And I went to see a psychologist, and I ended up being committed into the hospital. And then I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and dissociative identity disorder. And it was all stemming from trauma that occurred in the church. But that trauma it happened within the church, but there was a specific trauma that we were all correlating caused it. But now religious trauma syndrome is being viewed as complex post-traumatic stress disorder because it's the abuse that occurred over time, over the attendance of the individual in this style of congregation. And it is not yet considered an actual diagnosis, but it is in the process of being looked at as one, and it's been around since 2008. I think Marlene Wandale is the one who's
Marlene Wandale,
is the one who's attempting to coin it. But the reason why they're wanting to do this is because, just like you said, initially, when people came out of churches and they had these issues, there wasn't really anything, there wasn't enough evidence to enough people that had come forward to say what their symptoms were. They just said, well, you were, messed up in church. You received some maybe emotional harm from it, and it caused you some problems. But now what they're wanting to do is be able to, because all the symptoms are similar, they're wanting to be able to make sure that there can be a statistic on how often this occurs and how specifically to treat individuals who have experienced it.
Yeah, I can remember when I walked away in '99, there was nowhere to go. There were no specialists. There was a couple of, online sort of bulletin boards, and they were, websites. I'm not saying it was, that early, but they were online websites. I think one was called Walking Away or Walk Away from Fundamentalism or something like that is what it was called. And you would sort of just go on there and just chat, text-based chat with people. And some people had gone on to become, Wiccans, and other people had gone on to become atheists, and other people were sort of still questioning their Christianity. And I think the one thing that we could all say was that we're all in pain, but there was no labels, and that's why I kind of smile when I hear this, deconstruction, reconstruction. Back then it was just walking away. We've come a long way. We've come a long way, I think, as a movement of people that are, that are dealing with this, and it's a good thing. It's a very good thing.
Agreed.
So this religious trauma, is this something that's somewhat unique to fundamentalists? Because I was a moderate Christian, and I never experienced that when I finally left.
I don't know. It's a good question. I'm not sure. I think the intensity of what you go through as a fundamentalist, and you have to be so incredibly invested in what you believe, every part of your being, because quite often it's very cultish. You have to be cut off from the rest of everything that is not part of that group in the utmost of the fundamentalist movement. So when you try and, I think, move out of that or look at something different, it's quite a traumatic experience. And also there's
a tearing, isn't there?
There's a tearing. You lose everything there because quite often you're cut off. You're cut off from everything. You might have a very, very small amount of people that you can hang on to that are very generous and gracious sort of people, but the vast majority will cut you because you're poisonous, because you don't no longer believe what they believe. You're no longer anchored in that same belief. So I think potentially it is something that's more unique to fundamentalism.
And
Yeah,
I think
I
a lot of
think
people turn to substances as well. And so that makes people within the church alienate them even further. So they turn to booze, they turn to drugs because they're looking to numb the pain.
I was one of those that turned to alcohol, and I'm no longer drinking, but I was one of them that turned to alcohol. And of course, it was said about me that this was just a product of me walking away from my faith. But But I have heard, and I do agree that it is more likely to, or it seems to be more likely to have RTS coming out of an evangelical style of belief system. But I have seen Mormons and Catholics also talk about their religious trauma. So I think it can happen anywhere. It's just determined upon, the individual who is leading the services, I guess, and how they, tossed out the perception of Scripture to be.
Yeah, I can see the Catholics with the guilt that's instilled into them suffering from RTS, and Mormons being also a rather cult that practices disfellowship and the trauma that can come from being disassociated. So the Australian guys, have you heard of Dr. Darrell Ray and his Recovering from Religion program?
I haven't. T?
So there was a group that started recently in Australia, the Recovering from Religion Foundation, and I think they're connected to the organisation you just spoke about, but they're very new. They've started in Sydney. We have connected with them online. And I think that they are auspiced in Australia by the Australian humanists. So there is a bit of a movement in Australia, but it's very, very young. And I think it's largely made up of ex-Jehovah's Witnesses. I think that's where a lot of their people have sort of come from.
Okay. So are you going to have them on for future podcasts on your show?
Well, for sure. Why not? We've connected with them group wise, and we're posting in their Facebook group, and they're posting in ours, and we're advertising their meetings, and they're advertising our podcast. So we're definitely building a relationship.
And there's been a little bit of media recently around, or quite a bit of media actually around people leaving fundamentalist type religions, whether that is Pentecostalism or Jehovah's Witness. Certainly there has been a bit over the last couple of weeks, particularly around Jehovah's Witnesses, and that obviously is where T is saying we're connected in. So I'm glad that you remembered that, T, because you are our social media guru.
I am indeed. And you can pay 10% of your time.
I don't know if you guys happened to see last week's interview was with an ex-Jehovah's Witness who is a friend of mine and co-founder of the Hong Kong Atheist Society. One of the things that he mentioned was sort of the coming to terms intellectually with having been conned for most of his life. Like he's, only been the last 10 years. He's a few years older than me. I imagine he's probably in his late 50s. So 50 years of his life growing up in the Jehovah's Witnesses, and just the guilt that he felt. So I can certainly understand why there would be a need for these kinds of services.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one thing that sort of differs with T and I is we didn't grow up in this space. It was something we came into as teenagers. So we had a different context that we can actually reflect upon as well. So it wasn't something that was indoctrinated into us from day dot. And you certainly see a difference with people who grew up in the space and they're not able to reflect on anything else, and their anchor point is back into that fundamentalist space.
So were these when you were teenage converts? Was this your family converted, or you as individuals converted without your families?
Yeah, the latter. We were kind of. I definitely came in without my family. Came home from a church camp after being converted, came home, told my family that Jesus is the way, and by the way, you're going to burn in hell. That went over like a lead balloon. But B, you got sort of dragged in by your brothers, but still not mum and dad.
No, my mum and dad actually converted later as a result of me and my brothers. So I wholly and solely am responsible for that with them. And my father has passed, but my mum is still quite fundy. So it's quite confronting.
And how about you, Deanna? How was your journey into fundamentalism?
I didn't grow up Christian. We didn't ever go to church. We did have Bibles in the house. My parents did believe in the Christian God, but we didn't obviously live like we did. And they began going to church when I was 15. At the age of 15, I was married and I had one child. So obviously I felt like my life was a mess and in need of some repair. And I live in the South in the United States of America. That's what you do if you want to fix yourself. And so that's what I did. I went on into the church and stayed 23 years.
Was this the same church that your parents started going to, or a different one?
Yes, same church.
Same church. So they sort of brought you into this fundamentalist lifestyle?
Sort of. I think they began going like a month before I started going, and I decided to go with them. Yeah, it was my decision.
Did they follow you back out?
It took 5 years. But another woman came forward and told the same story I did, and they finally believed that I was telling the truth. But it took 5 years.
And were you married at 15 as a result of being in this church? Did they want like this whole quiverful movement, get married young and start breeding, or is unrelated?
I was a young, troubled teenager, you know. That's what I was, and I thought I had found the love of my life.
As teenagers do. Okay.
Yeah, as you do at 15. That's right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, we've been talking for almost an hour, so what we wrap it up. Anything you guys want to finish on something personal or where you're going next?
No, I don't think there's anything specific to you. I mean, we're just going to continue to unpack our journey as we keep going. We're about halfway through our second season at the moment, and we foresee many more seasons. So for anyone who wants to search up I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist, you can get it on any good podcast platform. We're also obviously on Twitter and as at Was Teenage on Twitter, and on Facebook you can search for I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist listener community and join in there as well. But we've got plenty more to say, and we started out thinking we'll do a few episodes and see how it goes, and we're nearly 30 episodes in and hardly scratching the surface. So I think for us it's been very therapeutic. It's been something that we possibly didn't even expect. It's brought stuff to the surface for us, but what's been exciting is people have come along for the journey. People have been prepared to actually have the conversation, and a lot of people are being quite personal and bearing all, and as they continue to explore and understand and unpack their own lives and reconstruct their own lives in a way that's a little bit more healthy, that's for sure. T, have you got something to add there?
No, I concur. I think what we've tried really hard to do is to tell the story, try to bring the positive out, as well as calling the bullshit when we need to call the bullshit. One of the things that we do in the podcast is we try not to name, especially when we're telling a negative story, we try not to name anyone, not just because we don't want to get sued, but also because our stories are 20, 30 years old, and people change, right? And some of the people that we're telling stories about may themselves have deconstructed, deconverted. So we do try and keep it sort of, the stories are entirely true, but they're not entirely factual, if that makes sense. And so in that sense, we see a point of difference with our podcast, but we also do interviews where we bring people in and let them tell their stories as well. So yeah, we invite people to come along and be a part of that, and
Okay.
see if we resonate.
B made a really good point that it's very therapeutic, and I can see how talking about it would help with that. Deanna, are you having that same experience that writing the book and talking is helping you cope and put this behind you?
The vast majority of my Twitter feed is full of people who have experienced religious trauma syndrome, and you don't come forward at first. You see a lot of religious trauma victims on there with the little cartoon picture and fake names, because this is their way of being able to talk about it without being known by who's talking about it, but that's fine, because this is their way of healing. And that's what I'm, my Twitter page is namely for them, let them know that they're not crazy. What they're thinking is legitimate, and that they're not alone. And that's what the book is about. I put my book down to publisher's cost only, so that those who couldn't even afford to purchase it could purchase it at a very minimal cost. And if they couldn't, they know that they can DM me and get it for free. I'm not trying to sell a product. I just want you to hear an experience that may be similar to your own, so that you know that what you're thinking is crazy, and that you're not alone.
Excellent. I like the fact that you're doing that and making it available to people. I think that's very noble. So, okay, and B mentioned some links to your podcast and to Deanna's book. I will put those links in the description. So those of you who are watching, if you want to find Deanna's book or Twitter pages, you'll be able to find them below in the description. And as always, please like and subscribe. If you would like to come on future show and tell us your story, we'd love to hear from you. And I thank all three of you for being on today and sharing your experiences and telling us how the differences between the U.S. and Australia is quite interesting. And so thank you for your time and for sharing your experiences with your followers. And I look forward to maybe we can have a follow-up discussion in a few months and tell us how things are going with your own journeys. So thank you for coming on.
That sounds awesome, and thank you for having us on.
Yeah, thanks for the forum.
Pleasure.
It's brilliant.
Yeah, great. So remember, everybody, please like and subscribe for our guests as well, and we'll see everybody next week. All right, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, thanks for listening, and don't forget we're on YouTube, so follow us on YouTube. Just search for Atheist Alliance International, and please subscribe and hit that notification bell. We're also on all of your favourite podcast platforms, so make sure that you follow us on there as well. See you next time.